The invoice arrived on a Tuesday, and Elder Soamira almost threw it away. Not because it was fraudulent. The authentication seals were legitimate, the routing codes were correct, the originating address traced cleanly to the Human Confederation's Office of Interspecies Obligations. She almost threw it away because the account number it referenced corresponded to a ledger entry she had personally archived 41 years ago, in the final administrative act of closing a program that the Velhari Collective had decided, after considerable internal debate, to pretend had never existed. The invoice amount was listed as 0. The attached message was 3 sentences. *, we are aware that what you did cannot be priced. We are aware that you were told, officially, that it never happened. We are coming anyway. *. Soamira set the invoice on her desk and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked out the window at the Velhari capital, which had been rebuilt twice since the events the invoice was referencing, and which showed no visible evidence of what had happened here 4 decades ago, because visible evidence was what you removed when you wanted a thing to stop being a conversation. She picked up her communications terminal. She had 2 calls to make. The first was to the collective's current Security Council, to tell them something was coming that she did not fully understand, from a direction she had not expected. The second was harder. The second was to the people who had been told 41 years ago that the collective would not be acknowledging their sacrifice. She had not spoken to any of them since. She had thought about them on certain days with the specific quality of a debt that has no payment mechanism, a thing owed to people you cannot face because the owing is too large and the facing would require you to admit the size of it. She sat with the invoice and the 3 sentences and thought about what it meant that humanity had kept the ledger entry open for 41 years. And thought about what it meant that they were closing it now. To understand what the invoice meant, you had to understand what the Velhari Collective had been 41 years ago, when a distress signal went out on a frequency that most of the galaxy had already decided not to monitor. The collective had been dying. Not slowly, not metaphorically, dying in the specific, accelerating, infrastructurally catastrophic sense of a civilization whose support systems were failing faster than they could be repaired. The cause was a pathogen. Not a weapon, not an act of deliberate destruction, but something that had emerged from the intersection of 2 trade routes and a biological exchange program that had seemed, at the time, like evidence of the collective's cosmopolitan openness. The pathogen was not uniformly lethal. Most Velhari who contracted it recovered, but it targeted the neural clusters responsible for the high-bandwidth pattern recognition that Velhari used for complex coordination, the cognitive architecture that made their logistical systems work, that kept their agricultural networks synchronized, that maintained the precise timing chains of a civilization whose infrastructure operated at a level of coordinated complexity that other species found difficult to fully appreciate until it began to fail. 1 in 8 Velhari who contracted it recovered with permanent impairment. 1 in 8, across a population of 4 billion people, was 500 million individuals. 500 million people who could no longer perform the cognitive functions their civilization's systems required. The collective had requested aid from the Galactic Compact 6 months into the crisis. The Compact had performed an assessment. The assessment had concluded, correctly, in purely logistical terms, that the scale of support required to stabilize the collective systems during the pathogen's peak impact period exceeded the Compact's available deployment capacity given concurrent obligations elsewhere. The Compact had offered sympathy and a 6-month reassessment timeline. The reassessment timeline was approximately 4 months longer than the collective's critical infrastructure had remaining before cascade failure became inevitable. The Compact knew this. The Compact's assessment had included the cascade failure timeline. Someone had read the assessment and made a calculation and filed the decision and moved on to the next item. The collective had filed a secondary request with 17 individual Compact member species. 14 had declined. 2 had offered token support that addressed approximately 3% of the identified need. 1 had not responded at all. The distress signal on the non-standard frequency, the one the collective broadcast in the 48th week of the crisis, when the primary diplomatic channels had produced nothing sufficient, when the cascade projections had been revised twice in the wrong direction, when the internal discussion had shifted from how do we solve this to how do we document this so that what happened is understood, That signal had gone out on a frequency that the compact's monitoring systems did not routinely watch. It had been heard by one civilization, a young one, 60 years into interstellar travel. Without the fleet capacity or the logistical infrastructure or the institutional standing in the compact to be considered a relevant actor in a crisis of this scale. Earth had heard it on a Thursday. By the following Monday, the first human ships were already moving. The lead coordinator of what humanity would later call Operation Standing Account was a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, and she was not a soldier or a diplomat or a political official of any kind. She was a logistics coordinator for an interstellar aid organization that had been operating for 11 years and that had, in those 11 years, developed a reputation for doing more with less than any comparable organization in human space. Largely because its founder had come from a background in disaster response and had built the organization around a philosophy that Amara had heard articulated exactly once, in her first week on the job, and had never forgotten. The philosophy was, the gap between what's needed and what's available is not a reason to stop. It is the problem to solve, She received the Velhari distress signal translation at 0340 on a Friday morning, because her job required her to monitor non-standard frequencies as a matter of standard practice. You found needs in the places where official channels had already decided not to look. She read the translation twice. She ran the cascade failure timeline against the collective's population figures and the support gap the compact assessment had identified. She sat with the numbers for 20 minutes. Then she opened her operational planning system and started building a response. Not drafting a proposal for a response, building the response. Because the gap between what was needed and what was available was not a reason to stop, it was the problem to solve, and solving it required starting immediately, and she had learned over 11 years of disaster response that the organizations that started immediately were the ones that arrived in time. Amara. Her deputy, a young man named Kwame who had been with the organization for 3 years and who had developed the specific quality of professional equanimity that disaster response work either built or destroyed, appeared in the doorway at 0420. You've been running logistics models for an hour. What are we doing? The Velhari Collective is going to experience cascade infrastructure failure in approximately 112 days, she said. The compact has assessed the situation as exceeding their deployment capacity. 17 bilateral requests produce 2% of the necessary support. So nobody's helping them, he said. Not in sufficient quantity, she said. No. He looked at the models on her screen. At the gap between available resources and identified need, which was very large, displayed in the patient, unsparing language of logistical mathematics. Can we close that gap? He said. She looked at the numbers. Not us alone, she said. But I think we can make it solvable. She turned in her chair. Get me a list of every human organization with interstellar logistics capacity. Commercial, governmental, private. Everything. He stared at her. Amara, the compact member states have already. The compact member states are not humanity, she said. Get me the list. He got the list. What happened over the following 12 days was not a governmental decision. It was not a diplomatic initiative. It was not the product of any institution that had the standing or the mandate or the resources to respond to a crisis of this scale. It was Amara Osei working a communications terminal for 12 to 16 hours a day, calling organizations and asking for things, and the organizations sometimes saying yes and sometimes saying no, and Amara noting both answers and moving to the next call. She called freight companies. She called university research programs with interstellar vessel access. She called the 3 human military reserve commands that had decommissioned logistics vessels available for civilian charter. She called an agricultural cooperative in the outer colonies that had 6 transport ships and a reputation for delivering to difficult locations. She called a mining consortium whose ships were large enough to carry the medical equipment the collective's hospitals needed. She called a retired compact logistics officer named James Okafor who had worked with her on a previous operation and who had, she knew, contacts in 17 different supply chains. She called 241 organizations in 12 days. 117 said yes. This was not enough. She called 23 more. 14 said yes. This was still not enough, but it was closer, and closer was the direction to move in. On day 14, the Human Confederation's Office of Foreign Aid, a governmental body that had been aware of Amara's activity since day 3 and had been watching with the specific uncertainty of an institution that had not decided how it felt about a private aid coordinator mobilizing civilian assets for a response of this scale without formal authorization, called her. "We need to talk about what you're building," the official said. "I know," she said. "Are you going to help or hinder?" The pause. "Help," the official said, slowly. "If you let us formalize it." "I'll let you formalize it if formalization doesn't slow it down," she said. "We have 98 days. "Understood," the official said. The formalization did not slow it down. The office provided 3 things that the private effort had been missing: governmental communication channels that could reach the Velhari Collective's administration directly, authorization for the military reserve vessels, and a budget line that allowed Amara to stop doing something she had been doing for 14 days that she had not mentioned to anyone because mentioning it would have produced a conversation she didn't have time for. She had been funding the operation's initial organizational costs from her personal savings. Kwame found out when the budget line was established and the accounting reconciliation produced a figure he didn't understand. "Amara," he said very carefully. "This number. It'll be reimbursed now," she said. "Move on. You spent. It needed to happen," she said. "The money was available. Move on." He moved on. He also, that evening, sent a message to 11 people he knew in the human aid community, describing what she had done, because he thought they should know. He did not ask her permission. He was certain she would have said no. The message was forwarded 4 times before it found its way, through a chain of connections he had not anticipated, into a Velhari diplomatic inbox. The Velhari diplomat who read it forwarded it to Elder Soamira, who was, at that point, the collective's crisis coordinator, because someone needed to know that the people who were coming had started coming before anyone in authority had told them to. Soamira read it. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote in her private log, the log she kept separate from the official crisis documentation, the one where she recorded the things that the official record didn't have categories for, a single sentence. "They started before we asked." The fleet that arrived at Velhari Prime on day 47 was not what anyone had expected. The Compact's crisis assessment had described the needed response in terms of military logistics vessels, coordinated deployment patterns, and the kind of fleet configuration that major powers used for large-scale aid operations. The assessment had been correct about what was needed. It had been wrong about what it would look like. What arrived was 131 ships, mining transports, agricultural carriers, 3 decommissioned military logistics vessels flying humanitarian designation flags, a university research vessel whose hold had been reconfigured over 30 days by engineering students who had volunteered their time and had not, by the documentation, been asked. 2 passenger liners whose operators had decided, independently, that their vessels could carry more useful cargo than tourists for the duration. A ship registered to something called the Kepler Outer Colonies Cooperative that was technically a grain transport and that had been loaded, with remarkable creative interpretation of its cargo designation, with medical equipment. 131 ships from 117 organizations, coordinated by a logistics system that had been built in 14 days by a woman who had started building it at 0340 on a Friday morning because the numbers said someone had to and the someone available was her. The Velhari administrator who received the fleet's formal arrival notification was a man named Dreshvoth, and he had been coordinating crisis response for 61 days and had not slept more than 4 hours in any single period in the preceding 3 weeks, and he read the arrival notification twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. Then he opened a channel to the lead vessel. "This is Administrator Dreshvoth, Velhari Collective Crisis Coordination. I need to speak to whoever is in command of this fleet." The pause. Then a voice. "This is Dr. Amara Osei, Operations Standing Account. I'm coordinating the logistical deployment. I should tell you up front that I'm not in command of the fleet in the military sense. Each vessel has its own captain and is operating under voluntary participation. I'm coordinating the distribution of what we've brought." He looked at the fleet manifest on his screen. 131 ships. He looked at the cargo declarations. He ran a rapid mental calculation against the support gap the collective systems required. Dr. Osei, he said, how much have you brought? A pause while she apparently consulted something. 63% of the identified gap, she said. Across medical supplies, food stores, and the technical personnel your infrastructure systems need. The other 37%, another pause. We're working on it. I have 12 more organizations in conversation. The first of them should have ships moving within 3 weeks. He sat back. You're 60 days from cascade failure, he said. We know, she said. That's why we started 47 days ago. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Administrator, she said. I need to start coordinating distribution immediately. Can you give me a contact in your logistics division? He gave her 3 contacts, because one seemed insufficient. She thanked him and moved on to the next thing. He sat in his crisis coordination office and looked at the fleet manifest for several minutes. Then he wrote something in his own private log, which he had kept since the beginning of the crisis and which he would eventually give to the historical archive, and which would be cited in 12 subsequent studies of the event. He wrote, *, they brought 63% of what we need. They are working on the rest. They started 47 days ago when nobody asked them to. I do not have a framework for what I am looking at, *. The compact found out on day 51. The mechanism of discovery was a routine sensor sweep by a compact monitoring station that logged the fleet's FTL signatures in the Velhari system and produced an anomaly flag because the fleet composition did not match any registered military or official diplomatic configuration in the compact's database. The analyst who reviewed the flag spent 2 hours trying to categorize what she was seeing. She eventually escalated it to her supervisor, whose escalation produced a briefing that reached the compact's Velhari Crisis Oversight Committee, the body that had produced the assessment 14 weeks earlier, concluding that the situation exceeded available deployment capacity within 18 hours. The committee was chaired by a senior compact official named Velron, who had been in institutional coordination for 30 years and who had, in those 30 years, developed a comprehensive understanding of how galactic aid response worked and what was and was not operationally possible within it. He looked at the fleet manifest. How, he said. The briefing officer had spent the preceding 4 hours trying to answer this question. A private human logistics coordinator named Dr. Amara Osei, she said. Operating under a human governmental authorization that was issued in week 2, but the organizational framework was built before the authorization. She started 14 days before the government formalized involvement. She built a 131-ship deployment in 14 days, Velron said. She identified 131 organizations willing to participate, the briefing officer said carefully. The organizational framework took 14 days. The actual fleet assembly and loading took another 33 days. She's carrying 63% of the gap we identified and has 12 more organizations in conversation. Velron looked at the manifest again. The compact's assessment concluded that this response exceeded available deployment capacity, he said. Yes. We based that on our standard deployment framework. Yes. Dr. Osei's framework is not our standard framework, he said. No, the briefing officer said. It appears to be something she built specifically for this situation, using resources that our assessment framework would not have classified as deployable. Because our assessment framework classifies deployable resources as those held by organizations with formal logistics certification, standing compact contracts, and established crisis response protocols. She paused. Dr. Osei appears to have classified as deployable resources any organization with a ship, a willing operator, and cargo space. The room was quiet. She reclassified the available resource pool, Velron said. She appears to have looked at the problem and then looked at all available assets and asked which assets could address the problem, the briefing officer said, rather than asking which assets were pre-designated for this type of problem. Velron sat with this for a moment. How much did this cost? He said. The human government's authorization included a budget line, she said. But the 14 days before authorization, she paused. The initial organizational costs appear to have been covered personally. By Dr. Osei. Yes. He looked at her. What does her personal financial situation look like after 14 days of funding a Galactic aid operation? He said. The record shows the budget line reimbursed approximately 80% of the amount, she said. The remaining 20% predates the budget line and doesn't appear to have been reimbursed. I don't have access to her personal financial records, but based on the amounts involved. She lost money on this, he said. Meaningfully, the briefing officer said. Yes. Velron stood up. He walked to the window of the committee room, which looked out over the compact's administrative complex, the architecture of an institution that had been building frameworks for 400 years, designed to be permanent and comprehensive and authoritative. The assessment said the response exceeded available deployment capacity, he said. Yes. And a private citizen looked at the same situation and disagreed. Yes. And was correct. The briefing officer said nothing, because the answer was yes and she had already said yes several times, and adding another yes did not seem like it would contribute something new. Velron turned back to the room. File a formal request to join the operation, he said. Under their coordination structure, we have assets that can close the remaining 37% gap if we restructure the deployment from concurrent obligations. We previously concluded that restructuring wasn't possible, someone said. We concluded it wasn't possible under the existing framework, Velron said. Reassess under a different question. Don't ask what we can spare. Ask what we can contribute if we treat this as the priority. A silence. That's a different calculation, someone said. Yes, he said. It is. He looked at the fleet manifest one more time. He thought about 14 days and personal savings and 131 ships made of grain transports and university research vessels and mining companies that had decided their cargo designations were flexible. Also, he said, I want a full briefing on this, Dr. Osei. Not her operational record. Her methodology. How she built this in 14 days. Because whatever she did, we don't have a framework for it, and we should. Amara was in the middle of coordinating the third supply distribution wave when the compact's formal request to join the operation arrived. She read it in between two other communications, noted it, and sent a reply that her deputy Kwame later described as the most diplomatically compressed document he had ever seen. It said, *welcome. Here is the distribution framework. Here are the current gaps. Here is what we need from you. Please confirm your first deployment wave timeline. No thank you for joining. No, we are honored to work with the compact. No acknowledgement that the most powerful interspecies organization in the galaxy had just asked to plug into a logistics framework built by a private citizen in 14 days. Just, here is what we need from you. Kwame read it over her shoulder. Amara, he said. That's the compact. I know, she said. They have ships. We need ships. Is there a problem? You might want to, he stopped. No. You know what, send it. She had already sent it. The compact's logistics division received the reply and was quiet for approximately 3 hours before someone made the decision to simply comply with the framework as presented, because the framework was functional and the timeline was urgent and there wasn't time for the kind of institutional negotiation that would normally precede joining an operation of this scale. They complied. The remaining 37% of the gap closed over the following 22 days. The Cascade failure timeline passed without the Cascade. Velhari Prime's infrastructure system stabilized. Not fully, the pathogen's effects on the impaired population were permanent and the long-term adaptation required years of structural change. But stable. The critical systems held. The civilization that had been 41 days from collapse was still there. On the day the Cascade window closed, Dreshvoth sent a message to every ship in the operation. The message was one sentence. It said, "You held the door." The collective's official position, formalized 8 months after the crisis, was that the pathogen response had been a successful coordinated aid effort conducted under compact auspices with valuable support from partner organizations. Amara Osei was not mentioned. Operation Standing Account was not mentioned. The 14 days, the 131 ships, the personal savings, the grain transport with the flexible cargo designation, none of it was in the official record. So Amira understood why. She had been part of the decision. The official position served the collective's relationship with the compact, which was necessary for the long-term recovery, and acknowledging that a private human citizen had done what the compact had assessed as impossible was not a story that made the compact comfortable, and the collective needed the compact comfortable. It was a practical decision. She had agreed with it in the meeting where it was made. She had not agreed with it in her private log, where she wrote, *, we are erasing the people who saved us because their saving us is politically inconvenient. I want this in a record somewhere. It happened. They came, *. She had closed the ledger entry from the human side of the exchange, marking the account as acknowledged, no official action, and had filed it in the archive category that meant, this is complete, no follow-up required. The account number had sat in that archive for 41 years, until the invoice arrived on a Tuesday. She made the 2 calls. The first to the Security Council was straightforward. She told them what the invoice said, what it referenced, and what the 3 sentences implied. They asked questions she could not answer. She told them to prepare for a delegation. They asked what kind. She said she didn't know. The second call was the hard one. She had not spoken to Amara Osei in 41 years. She had not spoken to Kwame. She had not spoken to any of the people who had come, who had been told that the collective would not be formally acknowledging their contribution, and who had gone home with the specific weight of a thing done that had not been recognized. She found Amara's contact information through the Human Diplomatic Directory. She called. Amara answered on the 3rd signal. She was 81 years old. Her hair was white. She was sitting at a desk that had papers on it in the specific way of a desk that belongs to someone who is still working. Behind her, through a window, was an Earth city that Amira didn't recognize. She looked at Amira. She said nothing. Amira said nothing. After 4 seconds of silence that contained 41 years of things that hadn't been said, Amira spoke. You kept the ledger open, she said. Yes, Amara said. Why? Amara looked at her steadily. Because you owed us nothing that can be priced. And because the version of us that comes to collect a debt for saving someone's civilization is not the version I wanted to represent. She paused. But we did want to come back. At some point. When we were useful in a different way than cargo ships and supply chains. The 3 sentences, Amira said. * we are coming anyway. * Yes. What are you coming for? Amara looked at her. 41 years ago, she said, the collective had an infrastructure problem that required human logistics creativity to solve. Right now, we have identified a situation developing in a sector of compact space that has some structural similarities to what the collective faced. She paused. We don't have the diplomatic standing to address it through official channels. The compact's assessment is that it exceeds current deployment capacity. Amira heard the echo of that phrase. We need a co-sponsor, Amara said. A compact member species with standing and credibility who will put their name on the operation while we build the fleet. The silence. You want the collective to sponsor a human aid operation, Amira said. We want the collective to do what we did 41 years ago, Amara said. Show up when the official channels have decided the situation is too difficult. Give us the standing to be useful. Amira looked at her. Amara, she said. We didn't acknowledge what you did. For 41 years, officially, it didn't happen. I know, Amara said. We took what you gave us and we didn't say thank you. I know. And you're asking us for help anyway. Amara looked at her across 41 years and the width of the galaxy. The gap between what's needed and what's available is not a reason to stop, she said. It is the problem to solve. She paused. That's true whether the gap is in logistics or in who owes who an apology. The silence this time was different. Amira felt the weight of the 41 years differently than she had before the call. Not lighter. More specific. More shaped. We'll sponsor it, she said. Thank you, Amara said. Don't thank me, Amira said. We're the ones who owe. I know what you owe, Amara said quietly. You can pay it by making sure this one works. The operation that followed was not identical to what had come before. The collective sponsorship opened channels that the human organizations couldn't have accessed alone. Amara's framework, refined over 41 years of subsequent operations, was considerably more sophisticated than it had been when she built it in 14 days on a Friday morning. The fleet that assembled was larger, faster, better equipped, and arrived earlier in the developing crisis than the Compact's timeline suggested was possible. Velron's successor at the Compact, a young official who had studied the 41-year-old operation in her training because someone had finally found the right documents and put them in the curriculum, watched the fleet manifest assemble from her monitoring station and recognized what she was seeing. She called the Human Coordination Office. "I want to understand something," she said to Kwame, who was 73 now and still working, "because some people found the work and the work found them. The framework you're using, the one that identifies non-standard deployable assets." "Yes," he said. "It hasn't changed substantially in 41 years, she said. "The core principle hasn't," he said. "The gap between what's needed and what's available is the problem to solve. Everything else is a variable." "That principle," she said. "Where does it come from?" He was quiet for a moment. "My supervisor taught it to me," he said. "A long time ago." He paused. She said the reason most organizations fail in crisis response is that they start from the assumption that what's available determines what's possible. She said the correct starting point is what's needed. You figure out what's needed, and then you find a way to make it available. "That sounds simple," she said. "It's not," he said. "Because the part where you find a way to make it available, that part is very hard. And it requires being willing to make it your problem even when nothing says it has to be." She thought about a private citizen spending personal savings to start a response that the Compact had assessed as impossible. "What does that require?" she said. "In a person." He thought about it. "The belief that if you're the one who sees the need," he said, "and you're the one who has any capacity to address it, that's sufficient. You don't need to be the right person. You don't need to be authorized. You don't need to wait for someone with more standing to decide it's their problem." He paused. "You just need to start. And then keep going." She looked at the fleet manifest. 189 ships. "Is that a human thing?" she said. "Or is that her specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "I think it's both." Amara was not on the flagship. She was at a desk on Earth, coordinating the distribution framework, because she was 81 years old and the ships were faster without her on them and the work was the same from here as from there. She got the confirmation when the crisis window closed. She read it. She set it down. She looked out the window at the Earth city for a moment. Then she picked up the invoice, the one she had filed 41 years ago and retrieved from the archive 3 weeks before sending it, and she looked at the 0 in the amount field. She thought about Dreshvatha's message. "You held the door." She thought about Soamira's face on the call. 41 years of a thing not said and then said. She thought about Kwame, still working at 73, because the work was still there. She thought about the 14 days. The Friday morning. The personal savings. The university research vessel whose engineering students had reconfigured the hold on their own time and not been asked. She thought about the 117 organizations that had said yes, and the 23 more she had called after that, and the 14 that had said yes and made it close enough. She thought about what it cost to hold a door open for 41 years. She thought about what it meant that someone had noticed. She filed the invoices closed. Not paid. Not forgiven. Because that was the right category. Not a debt settled. A circle completed. The kind of accounting that happens between civilizations when they are, finally, being honest with each other about what passed between them. She closed the file. She opened the distribution framework for the current operation and checked the remaining supply gaps. There were 3. She started making calls. So Amira wrote the final entry in her private log that evening, in the same log she had kept since the crisis, the one where she recorded the things the official record didn't have categories for. She wrote, "The invoice is closed. The account is settled. Neither of those statements is true in the way that matters. She paused. She wrote, asterisk what is true is this. 41 years ago, we were dying and they came. We told them officially it hadn't happened. They kept the record anyway. Not to hold it over us. To keep it real. To insist, in a ledger that nobody would ever audit, that the thing had happened and the people who did it had existed. Asterisk. She paused again. Asterisk they came back not to collect but to continue. As if the door they held open 41 years ago is simply still open. As if the work of holding it is ongoing and they never stopped. Asterisk. She looked at the window. Asterisk I have been alive for a long time and I have watched many civilizations. I have watched powerful ones that used their power efficiently. I have watched ancient ones that used their age wisely. I have watched young ones that used their energy extravagantly before it ran out. Asterisk. I have only watched one that seems genuinely unsure when the obligation to help ends. I do not think they believe it ends. I do not think they have ever believed that. That is not a comfortable thing to know about a species that is still very young. It is also the only reason we are still here. She closed the log. Outside, the Velhari capital continued its evening, rebuilt and rebuilt again, carrying no visible evidence of 41 years ago in its architecture, only in the people who had been there and remembered, and in the private logs that kept insisting. Asterisk it happened. They came, asterisk. And somewhere, on a planet on the other side of the galaxy, an 81-year-old woman was on her 6th call of the evening, asking an organization she had found through a non-standard resource survey whether they had any ships available and whether those ships could be somewhere they were needed by Thursday. The gap between what was needed and what was available was the problem to solve. She had been solving it since Friday morning.